Welcome to the Ad Nauseam Podcast, where classical gourmands everywhere can finally get their fill. Join us for a delectable discussion of Greco-Roman civilization stretching from the Minoans and Mycenaeans through the Renaissance and right down to the present. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here are your hosts, Dr. David Noe and Dr. Jeff Winkle.
Welcome, listeners, to episode 49 of the Ad Nauseam Podcast. We are coming to you from the Vomitorium. We have part two of a special episode featuring Dr. Patrick M. Owens from Hillsdale College. He's joining us tonight to discuss
Latin curricula.
Although
he is not in the Vomitorium with us tonight.
No, he was last time in the Vomitorium.
He had enough.
He made the rounds, but we're bringing him in remotely through the magic of the interwebs. And before we get down to business, we have a shout out to give, don't we?
We do. This goes to Aaron Potter. I remember Aaron Potter.
I don't.
You don't remember Aaron Potter? Mm-mm. Aaron Potter and his brother Ethan.
I remember Ethan.
Yes. Aaron was he was a stalwart in a number of my classes. Loved the classics. Very engaged, interested student. He is now teaching at Kalamazoo Christian.
Okay.
Just down the road, a fur piece from the Vomitorium here.
Did you say a fur piece?
I regret saying that.
Is that
now.
why you're wearing a hat?
Don't get me started, Hasselhoff. Okay. He says he doesn't get to teach much in the way of classics at Kalamazoo Christian. He would love to teach more. He says he always teaches Oedipus Rex in his World Lit class. And he says that his students are mostly horrified / amused by that, which he enjoys watching.
Of course. Yeah, the discomfort of others is always quite entertaining.
Right. I remember reading Oedipus the King in my mythology class with Aaron.
With Mr. Potter.
Yep.
Right. Well, we want to say thank you, Aaron, for being a loyal listener. And keep the flame lit out there, we'd have to say.
Yes, we really appreciate it.
The study of the classics and so forth. All right.
Dave, you got an opening quote for
us
I have
today?
An
opening quote. This one is also from Basil Lino Gildersleeve, just like it was last time. And after we give this quote, we're going to ask Dr. Owens, Patty, as we like to call him, if he wants to weigh in on this. He probably just dropped off the call.
Probably. Right.
All right. So here's Basil Gildersleeve from his Essays and Studies, Educational and Literary, 1890. He says, quote, "Grammatical study is in point of fact literary study and arises from the necessity of expounding to later generations some great work that has made its language the norm for the period or for the department, whereas for a long time the language of everyday life," this is the part I like, "the language of everyday life resists the analysis. And one is astonished to see how many centuries of thought and controversy were needed to settle the categories that every schoolchild knows after a fashion."
So we're going to ask our esteemed guest.
We're going to ask Patrick.
Okay.
If he'd like to interact with that quote, what does he think specifically about this portion of the quote, that the language of everyday life resists grammatical analysis?
Well, it's certainly true that quotidian language is more difficult to analyze according to the grammatical rules that we've developed to describe and categorize literary languages, specifically Latin and Greek. But I'm not sure that in any real sense it resists linguistic analysis. What do you think?
Well, what I like about this quote and why I chose it is because on the one hand, Gildersleeve is known as a paragon of grammatical knowledge. After all, I spent a great deal of time studying his grammar. But in this quote, he seems to be saying that grammar is in some ways an afterthought. It's really designed for literary study, the necessity of expounding to later generations some great work that has made its language the norm. So, in other words, I interpret this to mean a lot of people can use, speak, enjoy, manipulate, create within the language without understanding the grammar, but it's mostly after the fact that we need grammatical study. I thought this quote was apropos of our discussion last week in terms of the grammar translation method versus an inductive method for learning Latin. What do you think, Patrick?
When it comes down to choosing an approach or a method for language instruction, the instructor has to decide whether it is the language that is the object of investigation and learning for some ends like reading literature or appreciating the thinkers of that language, or whether the thing that's under investigation is grammar for grammar's sake. I think very often in the classics it happens that students and perhaps instructors think that they're engaged in language learning when really they are engaged in learning about language or learning the nature of grammar.
I see.
Is that your experience as well?
My experience has been that even when I'm seeking to speak Latin, which, as you know, I've been practicing for a long time, I tend to revert to the norms for teaching Latin that I use in English. So I've gotten fairly good at manipulating grammatical terminology within Latin. So I can talk about the cases and the forms and the tenses and the numbers and all that kind of stuff. But I don't really feel like I'm speaking Latin. I'm simply mirroring my ability to manipulate grammatical categories in English. I'm mirroring that in Latin. So I think I agree with your basic point. They're different kinds of skills.
I mean, is one of the things that Gildersleeve is saying in this quote is that, especially in terms of Latin or ancient Greek, of getting back to some sort of being able to speak and understand the quotidian language of the day is impossible. And that we have to have some sort of construct just to understand it on any kind of level. I mean, what do you think Gildersleeve would say against through this quote about, resurrecting spoken Latin and Greek? Would he say that's kind of a fool's game, or?
Right. Well, it's very easy to speculate since he's dead. He can't disagree with us.
Well, we can speak for him.
It does seem, based on the quote, I know Patrick has the quote in front of him too, that he's talking about the necessity of expounding to later generations. So grammar is needful because there's such a gap between how people really spoke then and what we know of their knowledge today.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we can maybe leave that there and the listeners can pick it up.
Unless I'm mistaken, though, Professor Gildersleeve was involved for at least a short period of time with Arcadius Evolanus, the famed proponent of active Latin and a contemporary of Professor Gildersleeve's. Gildersleeve brought him from Pennsylvania to Columbia College, where he was to give a lecture on his active Latin pedagogy.
Okay, I hadn't heard that story before. What I knew of Gildersleeve is that he was at Johns Hopkins, but this was probably earlier in his career, as you're saying. It'd be fascinating to find out how Gildersleeve appreciated spoken Latin. Perhaps a topic for another episode?
Of course.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
So let's give a quick review of what we covered last week, because we have to say that despite our best intentions, last episode turned into a smash hit.
Huge. Yes.
Yes. Dr. Owens was just lighting up the internet. People were downloading and listening to. Even individuals, Jeff, that I didn't think were interested in Latin pedagogy were tuning in for what's the best Latin textbook.
Right. Which are we going to actually answer that question tonight?
Well, we're not going to tell people till we get to the end of the episode.
Okay. That might give me too much away?
You're giving too much away.
Sorry, I'm new to this stuff.
How did you feel about that title, Patrick? What's the best Latin textbook? That was your title of choice.
Well, I don't think I came up with it, did I?
No, you didn't. But I'm throwing you a softball so you can scold me and say, I never meant to say.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So last week we covered Huilax and we covered Moreland and Fleischer, two of the deductive grammar translation method, and the text we're covering this evening.
Oh, a lot of them.
We'll
try to get to as many as we can.
Okay. Yeah. So we're going to look at the trio of Collins, Scanlon, and Henle. Then we're going to move on to the Cambridge Latin course, the Oxford Latin course. We're going to talk about Ossa Latinitatis. We'll probably take a side trip into Duolingo and Rosetta Stone, these digital Latin learning programs. And we're going to end up with what is, as the listener knows, my favorite, and I believe Patrick's as well, the Ørberg text, Familia Romana.
Excellent.
How does that sound, Patrick? That sound like a good order for us to take these in?
Yeah, is this show 3 hours long? I forget.
Yes.
It's like another Joe Rogan?
No, it just feels like it. That's all. More for the guests probably than for the audience. So let's start out with Collins, Scanlon, and Henle. And Dr. Owens, can you tell us, why did you suggest to group these three texts together? What was your thinking?
Well, all of these texts profess to teach ecclesiastical or church Latin or Latin for people interested in reading theology or even texts of the medieval period in Latin. I say profess because I'm not sure how well they accomplish that, and so we'll talk about them separately. I think the first in the group is Collins's Ecclesiastical Latin, and the title really says it all. I should say that I was a student of Dr. Collins is. He was a Greek professor of mine at City University in New York. And his book was written for the same sort of summer program as the Moreland and Fleischer text, intensive Latin. In fact, Rita Fleischer was also there at CUNY while I was studying under Dr. Collins. So I had the good fortune of getting to know Rita Fleischer, the author of that intensive textbook, and Dr. Collins. And while Dr. Collins was a fantastic intellect and a jolly classicist, a really fun person to study with, I'm not sure that his textbook does well by his
aims, maybe. You say he's a jolly classicist. So I think I'm often described that way. Maybe it's the wide black belt with the buckle. Maybe it's the red pants and the red coat. Maybe it's the fur-trimmed hat.
It's your weight.
We're going. Look, did you hear that? Throw it down.
Well, that wraps up this episode. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah. No, anyway, okay. So let's get back to Collins. Right?
So Collins, Dr. Collins,
who also taught at the same program as Moreland and Fleischer,
right,
composed this textbook as a remedy to what he saw in seminaries in the I guess 70s and 80s, wherein students were not learning Latin to any meaningful degree, such that they could read Latin texts that were important for seminary studies. And so he thought, by writing this shortcut, a text that is analogous to the intensive Latin text, that this would be a way to aid those students. And to a certain extent, it is. It provides students with a very brief overview, very small amount of vocabulary.
Okay.
And that's key, right? Because you can't acquire a language without learning vocabulary.
Right.
So those textbooks that shelter vocabulary to such an extent that students walk away with fewer than 500 or fewer than 1,000 discrete vocabulary words,
right,
they're not preparing students to read. And I think that's the fundamental flaw of a textbook like Collins.
So Scanlon is the next one, and this is one that I've taught out of a little bit. And if I'm remembering correctly, Patrick, refresh me and correct me if I'm wrong. Refresh my memory. The text has its goal as teaching scholastic Latin. So the examples are drawn from the kinds of things one might find in Aquinas, for example, or perhaps occasionally in Anselm, and authors of that time period. Is that how the text is designed?
That's right. I'm not sure that it's specifically to scholastic Latin, but it's geared especially toward ecclesiastical Latin, to introduce students to reading important authors from the medieval period and afterwards. So you identified Anselm and Aquinas, and I think both of those authors are represented there. There are large selections from codes of canon law, selections from parts of the Catholic Mass.
I don't remember any literary Latin in the work. Is that correct?
That's right. If one doesn't catalog those philosophers like Anselm or Aquinas as literature, and obviously that is a conversation for another show. Right. I think Latin literature is underrepresented in the textbook, and literary style, certainly poetic vocabulary, is underrepresented. And so with that comes the problem that a student who works all the way through Scanlon might conceivably be prepared to read some straightforward scholastic texts, maybe some medieval Latin prayers or ecclesiastical Latin prayers, but it is really not prepared to go forth and as we see in Augustine, tolle lege, that's not possible. That is to say, one couldn't finish that text and then pick up Cicero or Caesar or even Augustine, who's a more or less an early medieval author, or Leo or Gregory or dozens of other fantastic medieval authors. There's just not a lot of depth there.
Okay.
I'm curious, Patrick or David, if you know that if the Collins text or any of these more ecclesiastical texts were written in response to maybe shrinking Latin requirements at seminaries, and say, so instead of taking the requisite 4 semesters, here's your summer study,
get it done,
crank it out,
right,
get it done. I'm just curious,
bypassing the cursus literarum.
Yes, yeah,
that's a really interesting question. It's not so much that there was a decreasing requirement in, say, seminaries, and almost all these texts under consideration right here are written by Catholics, and they're written for Catholic seminaries.
Okay.
So in the case of Scanlon and Scanlon, they're responding, I believe, not to the decrease in requirements, but rather to the decrease in ability when students are entering the level where requirements are more carefully maintained. In 1964, Pope John the 23rd signed into law an important document known as Veterum Sapientia, that is the wisdom of the ancients, in a form of in a legal format known as an encyclical. And I'm sorry, it was not an encyclical, it was an apostolic exhortation, in the form of an apostolic exhortation.
That was close. Oh, my God, that was so close.
Which required
He almost confused an encyclical with an apostolic exhortation.
Well, there are differences, David.
I know, but we would have really heard it. So yeah, I know Centesimus Annus, but go ahead.
I don't want people, angry listeners, writing in.
Oh, I completely agree. You know how pedantic I am about technicalities, so you just go right on. But
okay, so that document required that all seminarians learn to read and write and speak Latin fluently before they begin studying philosophy, which was a prerequisite to studying theology. So that is to say, this law enshrined an expectation that students intending to stand for the Catholic priesthood would really know Latin. It also defined a very long reading list, an excellent reading list that I would bet most PhD students in the classics today don't fulfill. That is, it's longer and more extensive in both the pagan and Christian authors. In any case, this was sort of impracticable because students leaving high school in the early and mid 60s were no longer prepared to fulfill the requirements that would be prerequisites for any sort of course like that. And so there was a flurry of texts, that is a flurry of textbooks that attempted to bridge that gap.
Mm-hmm. And these fell into that
hole, and more or less. Collins to a lesser extent. Collins comes later, and it's a little bit more pessimistic at that time. There's no realistic expectation that anyone is going to learn to read, write, and speak Latin in the seminaries in the 70s and 80s.
Let's go on to Henle if we can for just a moment. And I have a question here. There are a lot of homeschool students in the United States that are using the Henle text. And I'm a Protestant. Jeff's Protestant. Our friend Patrick is a Catholic. The Henle text, it always surprises me, Patrick, that so many of these homeschool kids are using it because most of them that I know are Protestants, but some of the Latin exempla in the text have kind of language that is, I think, quite explicitly Catholic, that I think a lot of Protestants would be at least somewhat uncomfortable with. Are you familiar with what I'm saying? You think that's a fair assessment?
I am, and every year I have students come to the university level who have spent 4, 6, 8 years with Henle. I'm aware that there are at least 2 different versions of the Henle texts. One version is avowedly more religious or more Christian in tone, and another version is very toned down, where many of the exempla, perhaps the very ones that you have in mind,
right,
have been expunged
right,
in an attempt to make it more digestible to public school institutions. And in fact, it has been used in public schools, but it is widely used among homeschoolers.
right.
And I think that's because it was adopted by Memoria Press as a viable option, perhaps also a number of other homeschool options like Classical Conversations, I believe,
Right.
uses it.
Yes. Yep.
Is it broader in scope than Collins and Scanlon?
I think it has selections from Caesar. It has some decent present. I've never taught from it, to be frank. I've only read through it and studied it a little bit.
Yeah.
So my impression, Patrick, you can correct me, is that it is fairly broad. I have some other criticisms of it, but what do you think, Patrick?
That's right. It's very broad, and someone who finishes the 4 volumes of Henle of either version would be really well prepared to continue reading Caesar and perhaps read Cicero and or Virgil. By the end of the 4th volume, students have read long and large selections of text. That text is slightly adulterated and is annotated heavily, but they've seen a lot of Latin. And so while I have some qualms about the way that the language is presented there, and while it may not be my favorite text, a student who works diligently through the series will be able to make great progress in the learning of the language.
I would say something very similar about Huilach, which we discussed last week. I would make a very similar statement as you just made about Henle. Did you want to say anything else about this category, or shall we move on to the Oxbridge editions, as we call them, the Cambridge Latin course and the Oxford Latin course?
Well, just before we transition, I'd like to point out that although these textbooks are self-described ecclesiastical Latin primers, and maybe a little bit less, maybe that's a little bit less true regarding Henle, they perpetuate this idea, especially in the minds of homeschooled students and homeschooling parents, that there's a great divide between ecclesiastical Latin or church Latin or medieval Latin and whatever else is out there, classical Latin. So it happens not infrequently that people will ask me whether I teach ecclesiastical Latin or classical Latin.
Yeah.
And I am perplexed and I say Latin.
Yes.
Really, it is one language. There are certainly dialects within any language, especially a language that has existed for as long as Latin has. There are quirks that are notable about medieval Latin, and there's vocabulary that's specific to church or ecclesiastical Latin. But I wouldn't want any of your audience members to leave thinking that division is anything other than a difference without a meaning.
Patrick, how would you compare that difference to, say, the difference between Koine and Attic Greek?
Right. We can sit down and come up with ways of describing Koine. We can say, for instance, and for our listeners who may not be familiar, Koine Greek is the common dialect in which the New Testament is written and hundreds of other important texts. And it differs from other dialects, namely the Attic dialect, in that it has perhaps fewer anomalies, and it has maybe its edges polished off a little bit, so to speak. And the analogy, while helpful at first glance, doesn't really hold with medieval Latin, because we can describe the grammar and the syntax of Koine and how it's different. For instance, the thing that people point out immediately with Koine is that there's no optative, or there's very, very limited optative mood.
Right.
Some of the adverbs are used differently. Certain pronouns have remarkably different forms. That's not the case in medieval Latin. And in fact, medieval Latin or ecclesiastical Latin doesn't have any parameters. So if we look at an author like Leo the Great and look at his homilies, there's nothing that we can say that's specific about his Latinity, or Paulus Decanus, or even Bernardus of Clairvaux. we can't identify things that are specific to their language and syntax. We can say these authors are talking about something that Cicero didn't know about, namely about Christ and about a church, and they're living in a different socio-political world than that which Cicero would recognize. But once Cicero got over the strange topics, he really wouldn't have a difficulty understanding most ecclesiastical authors.
All right. Well, thank you, Patrick. That's an excellent summary of that set of texts. We're going to look at the Cambridge Latin course and the Oxford Latin course after the break. This episode of Ad Nauseam is brought to you by Ratio Coffee.
Ratio Coffee.
I took my time saying that.
Yes, you did. Because you were just contemplating the great cup of coffee you had this morning?
I was sipping it as we thought. Who knows what's going on here? Ratio Coffee, ladies and gentlemen of Portland, Oregon. My good friend Mark Helweg and his team have solved all of your brew-based and aesthetic problems when it comes to a cup of coffee.
Not some of them, all of them.
All of them.
Yep. There's no need to go down to the bagel barn, the brew.
The bagel barn and beanery.
Because you can do it right on your kitchen counter.
That's right. No more mass brewed coffee.
No. Stay away from that.
No more pulling a cup off of that scorchy underpad.
No. There's no need for one in these beautiful machines. I have the Ratio 6.
You've got the 6.
You've got the 8.
Can you describe the Ratio 6 for our listeners in poetic terms?
It's a beautiful, sleek machine. It's more of a work of art than it is a coffee maker, although it makes wonderful coffee too. It outclasses everything else in my kitchen. It's got the stainless steel carafe, which keeps everything nice and toasty for a really long time. So there's no need for that scorching burner.
There's off-gassing of the harsh carbon dioxide.
Yep, that takes place in the bloom stage.
In the bloom stage, when the coffee comes down through the Fibonacci head.
Yeah. Does that happen in your 8 too?
Oh, of course.
Yes, okay.
That's the hallmark, you might say, the signature of all of Ratio's products.
The off-gassing.
That's correct.
Yes.
That's what they'd like to be known for in the industry when they show up at conventions. And
those are the off-gassers.
Those are the off-gassers
over there. Yeah, you can't argue with the quality.
No.
Every morning I look forward to it. Hit the button.
It's part of your ritual.
Bloom stage. Brew stage, ready.
Boom. Yep. There's a good cup of coffee.
Right there for you.
Yes. So what can our listeners do if they would like to join the Brewvolution?
I love it. Join the Brewvolution. You go to ratiocoffee.com.
Okay.
And you can, if you punch in the
coupon
code ANCO.
That's right.
I believe.
Ad Nauseam and Coffee and Co.
Yes. And they will get, how much off?
It's 15%.
15% off the Ratio 6, the machine I've got. Yep.
We're working on a Ratio 8 promotional at some point, but the machines are just so popular that they just can't really keep them in stock. But you can get a Ratio 6 in a variety of colors. They've got black, matte, right? Stainless steel.
That's
and
the one
white.
I've got. It's beautiful.
Gorgeous machines.
Yep.
Ratiocoffee.com, RATIO coffee.com. Check it out.
Do it. This episode of Ad Nauseam also brought to you by Hackett Publishing. Hackett Publishing, based in Indianapolis, Indiana, and also in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They've been producing for the last 40 plus years high quality, affordable translations of the works from classical antiquity as well as many other subject areas across the humanities. I love them. I've used them in classes. I have them on my shelf at home. I can't say enough about how much I like what I find at Hackett Publishing. What about you, Dave?
Well, I like everything, honestly. They have great translations. I've used a number of them. Plato, Descartes, Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics. It's a great translation. They have new offerings on Aristotle, their new series. They have Len Krizak's translation of the Aeneid. I also love the Lingua Latina per se illustrata. I've used it at a number of different levels for my own children, in primary schools, at the university level. It's just a great series.
Yeah, I agree. I love their translation. I've used the Lombardo Odyssey translation for years in my myth classes. Their translation of the Bacchae is great. The artwork is great. I love that you can get their stuff digitally through Red Shelf.
That's right.
These guys have been with us from the beginning, and they've been so helpful and supportive along the way. And we'd love for you guys to support them too.
Yes.
And how can they benefit, Dave?
Well, they need to go to hackettpublishing.com. I'll spell the .com part first. COM. Keep it easy.
Yes.
Then Hackett, HACKETT, publishing.com. Find the texts you want, the books, the volumes that are going to help take your your classical studies to the next level, put them in the shopping cart.
Yep.
When you get to the part where you need the coupon code, you're going to want to use AN2021.
That's right.
And Jeff, what do they get?
They get a couple of great benefits. They get 20% off.
Oh, drop the mic.
I know.
Is
No,
that what the kids are
hang on
saying?
to the mic.
Okay.
Drop it in a second. 20% off anything they order and free shipping.
That's incredible.
Yep.
Phenomenal.
Yep, it's great stuff. Check it out.
Today's episode is also brought to you by Ad Astra Roasters. Ad Astra is a veteran-owned specialty coffee roaster located in Hillsdale, Michigan. Founded in Kansas in 2018, Ad Astra Roasters takes its name from the Kansas state motto, Ad Astra per aspera, to the stars through adversity.
I love Ad Astra beans, the stuff that they've sent us. The Tenebris blend is still my favorite. Dave, what do you like that from?
I love the Tenebris.
Tenebris.
I also like the Las Lajas Micro lot.
There's one more that I know that
Yeah,
you
the
really
Huehue
like.
Tenango.
Yeah, that's going to set you up for that, right?
Yeah, I love that one. Let's tango with the Huehue Tenango.
Yeah, it's great stuff. The poetry series is also a really great option for those wanting to read a great poem while drinking even better coffee. And listeners, head to adastraroasters.com, ADASTRA roasters.com, and you get 10% off when you put in the coupon code ANAA at checkout.
Absolutely. Check it out.
All right, so as we get back into it, we promised our listeners a look at the Cambridge Latin course and the Oxford Latin course. And I don't know, Patrick, can you just start us off with your overall opinion of both of these texts? You know, how do they compare to some of the stuff we talked about last week? Wheelock, Moreland, Fleischer. Where would you rank these guys?
So the Oxford, by which we mean the Oxford and the Cambridge texts, are similar. Mm-hmm. Not only did they come into production, or not only were they published around the same time, but they have the same approach. It's what's called a reading approach. And the reading approach offers students an opportunity to see the language in action, to see the vocabulary that they're learning, the new grammar that's been proposed, in a format that is narrative. So there's a narrative structure. You have a main character. The main character could be Horace, or he could be a character from Pompeii. And the idea is that there's a certain amount of buy-in on the part of the student. The student gets engaged in the narrative and is carried along through the harder parts of language study through the hook of having a narrative structure to the book. These books are generally intended for middle school and high school students. Rarely have I seen them employed in higher ed, although I know that they are in some places. And they do a great job of making the language accessible to students who maybe in a middle school or high school have Latin 2 or 3 times a week for an hour. They're always engaging pictures. These texts also include a lot of cultural information. So in every chapter, there's a culture section in which the historical facts of the ancient world and of ancient Rome are taught in usually an engaging or interesting way. Okay,
and I think in the Cambridge Latin course, correct me if I'm wrong, it's loosely based on Horace, the poet Horace, Quintus Horatius Flaccus, and his interaction with his pedagogue, right? A man named Orbilius, and I believe that Horace said of him that he was plagosus. Which means always quick with a beating. Isn't that correct?
That's right. You don't get that impression from the textbook.
Okay.
The textbook makes Horace out to be an easygoing fellow, and his teacher is too. I will say of both these texts, but more specifically of the Cambridge texts, the color pictures, although they might be interesting to younger students, they're really terrible pictures. I mean, they're awful. If I'm not mistaken, the artist of the Cambridge textbook is related to the main editor, and so there's a little bit of nepotism there. And one would maybe posit that the artist would not have gotten the job and might have been hard up for work if not related to a classicist who could make that happen.
Right.
It wasn't their best decision, though, because it does mar the text quite a bit. Another drawback of that specific text is that there is much less Latin than there is English in every chapter.
Right.
So for every, say, page of English, there's less than half a page of Latin. So that means that although there's a narrative structure and students may become interested in the story, they're not going to see enough Latin to overcome some of the infelicities of the text.
So at least a lot of room for, say, a middle school teacher to devote time to like toga parties.
Yes.
And other kind of,
Or
fun,
my favorite is Fustus Latina.
Fustus Latina.
Well, it's Latin club, right? Fustus is a club.
Oh, no. Oh, gosh.
That's brutal.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So a club as in, a cudgel, not a group
gathering
that meets together like a sodalicium or something like that. But oh well, live and learn. We all make some howlers from time to time. I believe that one of your teachers, the late Father Reginald Foster, described the Cambridge Latin individuals as balloon-headed. Is that right?
I think he said melon-headed.
Melon-headed.
Yeah.
Melon-headed.
Right.
Yeah, he had no time for them.
Yeah, mellow-capitulated.
It's that strange family that you don't want to run into in a forest in the middle of a horror movie.
No.
Exactly.
And what about the OLC, the Oxford Latin course?
Oh, right. So more or less the same thing can be said of the Oxford Latin course. It is a reading course that has a limited amount of Latin in it. It has interesting culture and pictures, and it's perfect for younger students who don't have a knowledgeable teacher or who need an introduction to language study, and maybe that language is Latin because they're at a classical school, but it's unlikely to precipitate a serious study of the classics.
Now, it strikes me as kind of as odd, so when I hear the names Cambridge and Oxford, my immediate assumption is, this is going to be very erudite.
Your pinky goes up.
It does.
As you grip the teacup.
As the
Am
teacup,
I right?
exactly right.
Of course.
But from what we've been talking about, it seems like in some ways quite the opposite.
That's right.
This is very low level.
It seems like this is a really good marketing strategy, though.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, without a doubt.
It's more rudite than erudite, perhaps.
Yes, very good. Yes.
Well,
we
let's
don't want to
go
leave
on.
out Ecce Romani, do we?
No, although I don't know a whole lot about it. Romans. It's a very popular text, isn't it?
That's what I learned from in high school, but I admit I don't remember a thing about it.
I suppose it's better than something like Audite Romanos, listen to the Romans. Or
I haven't heard of that
No.
one. No. I just remember lots of pictures.
Olfacite Romanos, smell the Romans.
Scratch and sniff?
Yes. I'm sorry, Patrick. Go ahead. What do you think about Ecce Romani? Ecce Romani.
Oh, it revolves around a wealthy family. I think the family are the Cornelii. Does that ring a bell, Jeff?
That sounds about right. Yes.
And they live in Campania, and so they're directly affected by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And now that I come to think about it, I think this is the text that Father Reginald Foster referred to as melon heads, because he would talk about melon heads in Pompeii. And these are the melon heads in Pompeii. The pictures show each one of the characters having a football-sized head, and there isn't very much action in the story. If I recall correctly, at one point their hand cart gets stuck in a ditch, and they remain in that ditch for 4 chapters, which might be a little bit too long to keep the interest of middle schoolers who already are not thrilled that they have to take Latin.
Yeah, I remember thinking, there's no way this family survived the eruption. There's no way. They can't get the cart out of the ditch. Right?
We should probably back up and speak to our legal team about the things that were said about the Cambridge Latin course.
Oh, really?
Well, I mean, they are purveyors of fine literature, and they've done me a good turn from time to time, and here we filled their pages with fake melon heads. And
yes.
So
wrong. Okay, we can. It's
a retraction.
Ecce Romani is where we find the melon.
Yes, not the Cambridge Latin course, august and distinguished.
Yes, well said.
Thank you.
Yep.
I don't know how should we describe the characters in the Cambridge text if we're not going to call them melon heads?
I don't know.
Do we need some other
less aggressively misshapen?
There,
okay.
I like that.
Right.
The LAMs.
There we go.
Okay, so moving right along then. Patrick, you've spent some time on Duolingo, and I know, Jeff, you have as well.
I have, yep.
With other languages, but not so much with Latin. And but I think Patrick, as with most as with most subjects, he has a pretty well-developed and strongly stated opinion on Duolingo's Latin offerings.
Yeah, I do have an opinion about Duolingo. I love Duolingo. I absolutely love it. I use it almost every day, and it is a terrific way to waste time. I've recently given up Facebook, and now I'm spending twice as much time on Duolingo than I was before.
Doing Latin or looking like
good heavens, no.
Well, I was evaluating the Latin, but just
anyone would use it for Latin.
Oh, okay.
Divertant.
So that's the problem. It is a great way to gamify language learning, or perhaps gamify the mystique around language learning, because I'm not sure that anyone actually learns a language with Duolingo, but they learn a lot of vocabulary. They may even learn the sounds of a language. Certainly, it has improved me in a number of languages, but its Latin system just isn't built to bring a person from not knowing Latin to being able to read any Latin, because it's created as a sort of game. And of course, there's a secret that we don't want to acknowledge, which is that Latin is harder than other languages because it's not spoken. At least it's not spoken readily enough. You can fiddle around on Duolingo for 45 minutes a day for a year, and then in fact you can go to Paris and you can order a croissant in French and you will get it right. And you can even make change then in French. But learning to order a Big Mac in Latin, no matter how cool some people might think that is, it's just not going to get you to a place where you can read any meaningful text or any text that people who study Latin generally want to read. Mm-hmm. And so it's not a program that has the substructure necessary for a literary language. It is a system that's built for a colloquial language and for colloquial recognition more than anything else. Mm-hmm. Right. And I'm not sure how valuable colloquial recognition is for Latin.
Let's back up on those Big Macs for a moment, though, because if I'm not mistaken, in Aeneid 5, which are the funeral games for Pater Anchises, I think it's Mezentius. I'm trying to remember. Maybe it's Mezentius is in the yacht race, and he gets thrown on a rock or something and doused in the ocean. And if I'm not mistaken, Aeneas spread out a board of Big Macs as the prize for a number of these contests. Is that right, Jeff?
That's ringing a bell here. Yeah, exactly. There was I remember it as combos. Yeah. So maybe not as irrelevant.
Not as irrelevant as one might think. So touche.
That kind of colloquial stuff aside, what do you think of just kind of the basic concept of, hey, language self-study 20 minutes a day? Do you think that has merit, for a study of French or of Latin as a way of kind of a better way to retain or learn a language rather than an hour and a half in class 3 times a week?
Well, I hope that the 20 minutes that I put towards French on Duolingo every day or every other day means that I'm retaining some of it. I'm certainly not learning any more. It's not expanding my French. It certainly isn't expanding my Italian. But I don't have an opportunity to speak any of those languages on a daily basis. Duolingo and some of the other tools that I have on my smartphone allow me to engage in those languages that I wouldn't otherwise be able to engage in, and they prevent those language muscles from atrophying. Okay. So that's a great thing.
Yep.
But it certainly isn't enough to make major gains.
Right. So the lofty promises they make in their ads, or at least they used to, is
some owl that bugs you and things like that.
Right.
It comes down to drunken parrots, I hear.
Drunken parrots.
There are a lot of drunken parrots, psidiki ebrii, in the Duolingo. Patrick and I have a mutual friend who actually was interested in working on the Latin version of Duolingo. I can't say the person's name on the air, but that person would have done a good service.
But wanted to, but did not?
Did not end up working on that particular project. What about Rosetta Stone? What's your analysis?
Yes, I didn't mention Rosetta Stone at one point. I am very impressed with the more recent version of Rosetta Stone. I don't remember if it's version 4 or what the number is, but I at one point was gifted a Rosetta Stone version 1 and version 2 in Latin, and it was abysmal. Not only were there problems, there were basic typos, and it wasn't a system that was conducive for learning Latin, and maybe it wasn't conducive for learning modern languages either. I don't know. But the more recent, which is the only one that's available for sale now from Rosetta Stone, is really excellent. That is, the language that's presented is clear. It is idiomatic Latin. It is organized in such a way that the learner does progress to more and more complicated structures. It's not for free. I think it's something like $150 now, which is much less expensive than it was years ago. And so it's something to check out, especially for homeschooling families who don't have someone at home who knows Latin and maybe don't want to spend money to take a great course over the web with a tutor, or I was going to work up to that. So maybe they for whatever reason can't work with Latin per diem or with David Noe over the web. Maybe they're in Australia and their schedules just don't work out.
Right.
Rosetta Stone would be an option, not the best option, but an introduction to Latin that could work.
Okay. Sed quid de insiciis hamburgensibus censetis?
Quid ipse censeo de insiciis hamburgensibus?
Insiciis hamburgensibus censetis. What do they think about hamburgers in Rosetta Stone?
If you're getting at the fact that it's still a colloquial approach, you're absolutely right. If you think that being able to order a hamburger in Latin is neat, that sort of thing is there. But what's also there is ancient vocabulary. Unlike, say, Duolingo, the vocabulary that is presented in Rosetta Stone is much more authentic, much more original, and it's pretty well crafted.
Excellent. So shall we move on, Jeff, to, we have two more in this series. We've got the Ossa Latinitatis of Father Reginald Foster, and then, of course, the Pièce de la Résistance, just to throw in a little Spanish, is the Lingua Latina per se illustrata.
Yes.
So, Patrick, you were a friend and mentee of Father Foster. Can you tell us about the Ossa Latinitatis? I think this is kind of making a bit of a splash among some Latin teachers and aficionados. What are your thoughts on the text thus far?
You're right, David. Father Reginald Foster was my mentor and a friend and a wonderful teacher. I'm truly blessed to have studied with him and carried on a long friendship with him, and I miss him very much. His teaching style has been described as unique, one of a kind, life-changing, and I think those are apt descriptions of what he was like in the classroom. It's difficult to distill a dynamic teacher into pages of a textbook. Some of the ways that Reginaldus approached Latin were idiosyncratic, and that extends especially to the eschewing of grammatical vocabulary that is very precise. I'd say the eschewing of grammatical jargon in place of simple descriptions of what things are, or the use of number systems instead of, say, tenses. And it's difficult to see the application of Ossa Latinitatis in a classroom of middle school students or high school students, certainly, because it doesn't have some of the luster that the text that we described most recently have, like Ecce Romani or the Cambridge text. What it does have is a profound insight into the inner workings of the language. It's a text that I've picked up a number of times and have been surprised at how clear the articulations and the descriptions of the language are. In a couple of circumstances, I've found that I've learned something from reading his notes there, and I think I dare to say almost all of us will. Perhaps all of us have something to learn by picking up Ossa Latinitatis and reading it through. I'm unlikely to use it in the classroom. It's a serious tome. I don't know that I'll be comfortable using it as an instrument like that, but I do and I would continue to recommend it to my students and my colleagues as a sort of reference text, or a text with which one can hone one's conception of the language. A colleague asked me recently whether I believed it could be used productively in one of our classrooms here at the college. And I responded that it could. It absolutely could. And in fact, the method is the best method in the world, as long as the person using it is Reginald Foster. And when it's not Reginald Foster, there's something maybe missing.
That's going to narrow the sales considerably, I think.
Yeah, no doubt.
Maybe so. I do recommend it to your listeners who already know a great deal of Latin.
Right.
Because, as I said, I'm learning from it myself, and I think we can all learn something from it.
I have a copy, and I'm working through it page by page, and have been for some time, for precisely the reasons you mentioned. It is quite insightful. All kidding aside, every time you said eschew, I wanted to offer you a tissue or something, but...
Oh no, I hoped we were going to delete one of those eschews.
We'll have eschews with it afterward, I'm sure. So Winkle, this brings us down to Lingua Latina per se illustrata. And
Which is your personal
It is
favorite.
mine,
Okay.
yes, and I think it might be Patrick's as well.
Okay.
We probably should say that it really has nothing to do with the fact that Hackett Publishing is the owner of this imprint.
It's just a happy coincidence.
It is.
Okay.
But I was drawn to Hackett because they put out this fantastic text. So Patrick, can you share a little bit of your thoughts about this text? Do you remember what your first exposure to it was? Why you have taught from it on multiple occasions, as I understand?
I would like to second your point that our endorsement of this text has nothing to do with the underwriting of this blog by Hackett, because I'm not getting any of that money, and they're not giving me anything to support.
Right. There's no blog. What is?
Oh, not blog. What is this thing called?
His
podcast.
great Latin learning has driven him mad.
Movie?
It's a podcast.
Podcast. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So Lingua Latina per se illustrata.
Fantastic text.
Because
we have to describe it. We have to go into
yes.
Lingua Latina per se illustrata is unlike any of the other texts that we've described thus far. It is a direct method, or a natural method, or a active language approach to Latin learning, wherein students see from the beginning of the text to the end only Latin. Unlike other language textbooks, the vocabulary isn't presented with English and Latin equivalencies. Rather, students are led from very simple sentences. I believe the first sentence of the first chapter is Roma in Italia est.
Indeed.
From simple sentences like that, all the way through selections of Catullus, Martial, Horace, all in one textbook. And between the beginning and the end is a marvelous story that reads like a novella. That is at times gripping and at times sort of silly.
Other times quite pathetic in the sense of, producing pathos within us, compassion and misery, sadness for the plight of the runaway slave Matus, and some of the other interesting dramatic moments that occur within the story.
So nobody's getting their handcart stuck in a ditch for 4 chapters?
No.
Okay, all right, good.
There's vehetur, Cornelius vehetur equo, Cornelius rides a horse. That's just one highly idiomatic expression, and the text is laced with them all. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever found one expression in the textbook that is not idiomatic. And Patrick's knowledge of Latin exceeds mine, so he'd be a better judge. But its Latinity is very high.
So it's all in Latin. The whole thing.
Yes.
Is in Latin. So how do you, both of you, how do you go about bringing in the grammatical aspects of it? And say, this is a genitive, and explaining what a genitive. So how does that work into a text like this?
Well, at the end of each chapter, there is a grammatical discussion of Latin concepts in Latin. And what is that portion entitled? Is it simply Grammatica, Patrick?
Grammatica Latina.
Grammatica Latina.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So then there are blanks put in there. So instead of having the entire word filios, it's fili and then a blank, and the student is supposed to add the masculine singular nominative second declension ending, filios. Right?
Okay.
Filius est quintus, filius est Marcus, etc.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah.
How effective do you think, Patrick, the Grammatica Latina portions have been in your teaching of the text?
Well, I don't usually use them. I don't find that they are the best way to present students with that material.
Okay.
And they're not really necessary. If students are working through the text diligently and doing exercises, they really don't need to be told what a genitive is, any more than a student of English or a baby of English needs to be told what a possessive is. But it's enough simply to know how the language works. There's a premium placed on grammatical knowledge, or what I call meta-knowledge, meta-linguistic knowledge on classical languages. Like, it's somehow important to know what kind of use a particular participle is, whether it's circumstantial or adversative, but really the Roman doesn't make that distinction. The Roman doesn't ask himself or herself what kind of participle was that, or even was that a participle. I would bet that most Romans lived and died without ever knowing the term participle, participium, linguistically speaking. They probably didn't even know the parts of the speech, of speech. So why is it necessary for our students to know such highly grammaticalized or such highly specialized terminology for grammar, like the different uses of the ablative or different uses of the dative? Right. And so I dispense with that usually. And what that means is I have more time to spend with my students really acquiring the language than dissecting the language.
Yes, to the extent that I'm able, I follow a similar pattern, and I typically don't assign or read through the Grammatica Latina. And I only use the pensum K, the third of the three pensa, at the end of each chapter. So there's A, B, and K, or A, B, and C. And C is a series of questions in Latin, which then the students, in my course at least, are required to answer in Latin. I think, Jeff, as a professional illustrator, former cartoonist,
yes,
I think you would be much appreciative of these individuals as they're illustrated in the story. It's quite consistent. Hackett now has it in full color, which is really nice.
Yeah.
Technicolor.
What's the proportion of head size to torso?
Small squash, maybe. Butternut, I would say. Maybe,
butternut, okay.
Maybe acorn.
Okay, all right. So I'm intrigued.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, how do you go with the text go about testing your students?
Well, I'll let Patrick answer this first, and then I, as usual, have some opinions.
Sure.
That is a good question. There are questions provided by the text and in the exercise book that can be used for assessment on a section by section basis. So students can work through one of the three sections. Each chapter is divided into a section. And then the instructor can determine whether students have mastered the material through those sorts of open-ended questions. I often will have students summarize in English a very large section. So if we finish reading a couple of pages, I'll elicit summaries in English rather than have students translate directly from Latin into English.
Right. What do you think about this idea, Patrick? I often have students, I test them on vocabulary, but I try never to go from the target language to the mother tongue, but instead I'll give them 30 English words and ask them for the Latin equivalent. I think that's more effective than working in the other direction. And sometimes they don't like my particular Latin construals. For example, I guess I should say my English construals. So one important verb in the book is pulso, pulsare, which can mean a wide number of things, but in the book it's often used for knocking on the door, right? So I use that as my English version, right, to knock on a door. Well, of course, the word means a lot more things than that.
Right.
But I've keyed it to the context, and so sometimes students can't recognize the particular English I've chosen.
I see.
So as to figure out, well, what does he mean? And they eventually get around to it.
Gotcha. Interesting.
Or give them a portion of Latin that they've studied, say the beginning of chapter 2, which is on the Roman family itself, and I'll translate it all into English, a paragraph, and then I'll have them put it back into Latin. So as much as possible to work from their mother tongue and into the target language.
Gotcha.
Would you say, Patrick, there's some merit to that? You can call me out in front of our audience and say, deliras, right? You're nuts.
I certainly wouldn't say that you deliras, but that is simply not something I do, not for any principled reason. I just, maybe I've never thought of it. Mm-hmm. Rather, I use other exercises like filling in the blanks or talking about the problems that the characters are facing. Certainly creating example sentences that are imitative of the text itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the series of books begins with Familia Romana, and then it moves on into the green-covered one, which is Roma Aeterna, right? After which there are a lot of supplementary materials. The Fabulae Sirdae, which were written, if I'm not mistaken, by Luigi Miraglia. Is that correct, Patrick?
That's partially correct. It was written by a number of us at Vivarium Novum. And unless I'm mistaken, my name is listed among those authors.
I know you contributed.
And that text is useful because it is a supplement to Familia Romana itself, rather than a text that should be read after Familia Romana. Mm-hmm. So I would add that while Familia Romana, which is the first volume in the Lingua Latina per se illustrata series, is a standalone text, there are these other texts that amplify the virtues of Familia Romana. There is a text called Colloquia Personarum, which are dramatic dialogues featuring only the characters from Familia Romana, such that students already know the character. They know what type of person each one of these characters is, and they can then interpret them dramatically through a scene. And that really excites students, especially students in middle school and high school.
It's like if I may, it's like a sitcom spin-off is what it is, really.
That's right.
Well, Potsy got his own show temporarily.
Okay. Lasted a week, I believe.
Yeah, it didn't last long.
The textbook is Cheers, and Colloquia Personarum is Frasier.
Yes.
There you go. Okay. A successful spin-off. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Then there are other supplements like the Fabellae Latinae, which are short stories in which no new material is presented. And that is really wonderful because that gives students who are maybe struggling to keep up some breathing room. They get more repetitions of the vocabulary that they've been seeing. They see the same grammatical structures. And so it is engineered in such a way to provide students with more of the same input to create an internal representation of the language in students' minds in a similar way as babies do in their native tongue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, this has been an excellent episode.
Yes.
I think, if I don't say so myself, I think we need to wrap this up here. You know, we had here on our script, Dr. Winkle, that we were going to ask Patrick some additional questions about Latin pedagogy, ask him for a demonstration of spoken Latinity. What are 2 or 3 traits that he thinks would make an ideal Latin teacher? Advice for newbies who are just starting out, either studying Latin or teaching it. But it's clear now that we need to save these topics for...
Those questions alone, I think we could talk for
the callback.
For an hour or more
for
about
sure.
that. Yeah. So we got to have Dr. Owens back on.
Yes.
Yep.
Patrick, would you like to give a valediction of any sort before we say goodbye and wrap up this episode?
I would love to. Valetote omnes auditores.
There we go. It's the future imperative there. Valetote.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. So long, all you fine listeners. Actually, technically, there weren't any adjectives in there, but you could throw one in there, couldn't you? Other than omnes. How about, I don't know, eruditissimi or something like that?
Sure, yeah.
Butter up the listener. Yeah.
Butter up the audience a little bit.
Yeah.
Keep them coming back for more.
Of course.
Exactly. Right.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Patrick. And
Thank you both. It's a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah,
likewise.
Thank you so
Take care.
much.
Well, Jeff, that wraps up this week. We got to get out of here.
We do.
We got to say some thank yous to the folks that make this possible.
Yes.
First of all,
Thanks to Mishka.
Yes, our intrepid sound engineer. She weaves this all together. It's almost magic.
It is. We couldn't do it without her.
Absolutely.
Yep. And also thanks to Ken Tamplin and Scott Van Zen for the great music.
Yes.
That you hear at the beginning, in the middle, at the end.
Screaming guitar
Screaming
riffs.
guitar. I wish I could play like that.
Well,
Man.
I wish I could play the guitar at all. You're quite accomplished, but I have to say, you know Van Zen.
I know Van Zen, right?
No.
He's one of those guys that when I hear him, it's
Yeah.
like it's inspiring, but also makes you want to quit because you can't get there.
The guy can play the blues. He's actually coming out with a new album. I think it's an all-instrumental album.
Really?
I can't remember the name. We'll say it on air, but I've been listening to his Without Words, which you can get on Spotify. My favorite track on that album is Fremont Street.
Fremont Street.
Yes.
I'll check it out.
Because he was out in Vegas. And
Okay.
it's got this great acoustic bridge in it. Just gorgeous
Very
stuff.
cool. He's phenomenal.
Yeah.
You know. Dave, before we go, will you tell us something about the Moss method?
I would love to. You know, this episode has run a little long, so I'm not going to spend too much time. I'm not going to dilate on the Moss method, but we've got some good things coming up this fall.
Okay.
We're going to be running office hours, and we're going to have a big fall promotional, a back-to-school special,
Great.
you might say.
Yeah.
So go to mossmethod.com, check out some of the new video offerings I'm preparing, and come along with us and learn some Greek.
Sounds great. So listeners, shoot us an email, jeff@adnauseum.com, dave@adnauseum.com. Tell us what you like, what you don't like. It's the best way to get a shout out.
Oh, and we love those shout-outs.
We love those shout-outs.
What a great way to connect with people that are actually listening to us.
It is great. It's great. So don't hesitate. We love to read it, and we love to respond.
Absolutely.
Dave, you got our gustatory party shot, don't you?
I do, but Jeff, aren't we going to tell them what's coming up next week?
Sorry. Exactly. What's coming up?
Well, next week we're going to go old school, by which I mean old school comedy.
Oh.
Yeah, now this is going to be a stretch for me. There's quite a bit of ribaldry in this one that's coming
You're
up.
kind of uncomfortable about
I
this,
am,
right?
I don't like to work blue.
Okay.
Let's be honest. I'm a family man. I know there's a whole world of humor that works on double, on triple entendres and so forth. And so I'm a little uncomfortable with that, but we're going to give it a go. It's Aristophanes' Frogs.
Yes, the master.
Yeah, an original Winkle translation.
Yes,
in fact.
which I'm very excited about.
So you got to tune in for that.
Yes. Okay, now it's time for the party
It's
shot.
time.
Okay.
All right. So this comes from Ben Scott. Jeeves and the Leap of Faith is the name of the work. And Ben Scott says, as Sherlock Holmes once observed, when you've excluded the inevitable, whatever remains, however unpalatable, must be lunch.
That's awesome. Thanks for listening.